Hi, I'm Steve Breyer. I'm a faculty member at the City University of New York in the Graduate Center and at the Joseph S. Murphy Institute for Labor Studies and Worker Education. Teach labor history there. I'm joined by Eddie and Ajin, who will introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about themselves. Maybe do that now, and then we can sort of...
I'm Ed Ott. I'm currently a distinguished lecturer at the Murphy Institute of CUNY's School of Professional Studies, and I'm the former executive director and political director of the New York City Central Labor Council, and I've been beating this drum for 42 years.
And also my personal hero. I am Ai-jen Poo, the director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, which is an alliance of 33 organizations of nannies, housekeepers, and caregivers for the elderly in 17 cities and 11 states around the country.
So, since we are a small group, I think our hope tonight would be we'd each make some opening comments about sort of the state of the labor movement. I'm going to talk first as a historian, try to contextualize this a little bit and sort of situate the current place we're at, which both Ajit and Ed will then sort of amplify. And we hope then to throw it open to you to hopefully we'll have an exchange of ideas and thoughts about the future of the labor movement in the United States and internationally. I just finished teaching a labor history class to a group of mostly workers, a lot of shop stewards and rank and filers who are enrolled in the Murphy Institute and on our labor studies master's program. And it's always a challenge and an interesting challenge to teach labor history because it forces me as a labor historian to think about how to contextualize the history of the labor movement. And with this course, I started back, as I always do, in the early 19th century with the very origins of American capitalism and sort of carry it forward through the struggle over slavery and slave labor, what comes in the late 19th century with the first waves of immigration. I'm not going to rehearse all that. I'm not going to give you that kind of a lecture. But what I want to focus on is what is always thought to be the great turning point in American labor history, which of course is the rise of industrial unionism in the 1930s. And I think we have a tendency in history, in the field, in the profession, to sort of look at large institutions to help us understand why things change. So the 1930s are often explained by reference to the passage of the Wagner Act in 1935, which is the act that really is the Bill of Rights, if you will, for the American labor movement. It provides a legal context. The Wagner Act and then the passage of the National Labor Relations Act and the National Labor Relations Board in 1935, 1936 provides an important legal prop for the organization of workers during the Great Depression. But what's often forgotten or not sufficiently emphasized, even if it is mentioned in much of the way we think about this history, is the Wagner Act didn't come about because it seemed like a good idea to Democratic Party politicians or because Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was very much into the final stage of his first term as president, thought that this was something that was important or that it would even sort of bolster his re-election campaign, which was coming up in 1936. What forced the issue was the militancy of American workers. Starting with the Great Depression, starting with the organization of the unemployed. One of the things I used to love when I taught in the intensive here in the summers is I would often talk about the great,
I'm sorry.
Good. I'll speak even less now to give you a chance to speak. What I used to love about teaching in the intensive was when I talked about the organization of the unemployed, I always had Annette Rubinstein in the audience. And Annette would always say, in 1930, when we sort of organized the first unemployed demonstration in Union Square, and it was, as a historian, it was a wonderful reality to have Annette there to sort of really personalize and explain how important those struggles were. But what happened was American workers, after a terrible period. The 1920s were a period of great defeat. The labor movement was at its lowest ebb, starting with 1930 and 1931, but culminating in 1934 with a series of incredibly important strikes in Minneapolis, Minnesota among the Teamsters, in San Francisco on the Longshore and the organization of the ILWU, and finally in Akron, Ohio, and the organization of rubber workers. There's an arc of working class militancy that really accelerates through the struggles in 1934. 1934 was an amazing period, and I would venture to say, other than committed leftists, there are very few people who sort of really understand what happens in that year and what impact it has on the creation of the Wagner Act and the NLRA and the NLRB. In those strikes, two of which were essentially general strikes of workers in the cities of San Francisco and Minneapolis. Not only were important unions organized, the Teamsters and the ILWU, built around industrial union practices, but each of those three strikes were led by radicals, were led by communists or communist sympathizers in San Francisco, Trotskyists in Minneapolis, and socialists in Akron, Ohio, the organization of rubber workers. And what those three strikes was a beacon for the labor movement and the organization of the CIO that followed it. You don't get a CIO without those three strikes. You don't get a labor movement that is fearful of the mass actions of industrial workers, and you get John L. Lewis as the miners' leader saying we need to organize a Congress of Industrial Organizations in 1936, following the passage of the Wagner Act. You don't get the Wagner Act without those strikes, because what happens is there's a great fear of working class militancy. And what happens is the labor movement the organized labor movement responds to that sort of working class militancy at the base, and really takes off in a fundamental way with the organization of the CIO. Millions of workers are brought in to the union movement, and that sort of process continues through the great strikes at Flint, Michigan, the organization of the UAW in 1937, the organization of the steel workers, defeat first in 1937, but then the organization of the Steelworkers Union, also supported by the miners in the 1940s and 50s, the organization of Ford Motor Company in 1941 after a bloody battle. None of that comes about without that sort of sense of militancy. And the labor movement really sort of rides high from the period of 1935 and through the Second World War and to the end of the war. And we reached the peak of union organization of the American working class in 1946-47 with the organization of about 1 in 3 American workers are members of unions. Anybody know what the percentage of workers in unions is today? It's in single digits now. In single digits. Nine.
Private sector.
Yeah, in the private sector, certainly. In the public sector, it's higher, but overall, if you take the two together, it's slipped below double digits. So we've seen this enormous decline in the power of organized labor. Some of that had to do with, and we need to be clear about this, some of that had to do with, at the end of the Second World War, with the rise of a virulent anti-communism in both political parties, not just the Republican Party, but also the Democratic Party. The passage, of course, of Taft-Hartley, the Taft-Hartley Act, which becomes law in 1948, essentially outlaws all of the tools and tactics that had allowed for the organization of workers in the 1930s and 40s. Secondary boycotts, sympathy strikes, the union, the ways in which you have a closed shop instead of an open shop. All of those things go out the window legally, and it's supported by the United States Supreme Court. So we see a marked decline of the labor movement, and in talking about this with my students this semester, who are workers and union members, I asked them what they thought explained the decline. And we talked about a lot of things. We talked about politics and the nature of anti-communism and the way in which political culture in the United States has militated against any kind of workers' party, any kind of party, as we see in European and Latin American and Asian countries, any party that speaks for the broader political interests of the working class. So we talked about that. We also talked about a kind of complacency and a bureaucratization of the labor leadership. So that labor leaders, we have a huge disproportion of professional labor leaders in this country as compared to other countries in the world. 5, 6, 8 times the number of union officials who are paid in a professional way to be labor leaders. That's another sort of thing that we need to confront. And one of the reasons strikes are successful and the organization of workers is successful is because of the kind of militant commitments of rank and filers, not professional paid organizers, though we don't want to minimize that. We did talk some about sort of the impact of mass culture and the loss of a clear working class culture and a working class cultural identity, which had been very much a product of the 1930s, 40s, and even the 1950s. Lots of explanations for that, including the rise of mass culture, television, radio, the ways in which consent is manipulated by the capitalist sort of economy and the broader society. But what we came around to was, in effect, all of the standard ways in which the labor movement has often blamed new workers for defeats and inability to organize are the exact same arguments that have been used for 150 years against every subsequent immigrant group that has come into the American workforce, and that the arguments against Asian and Latin American and workers are of the same type and quality as the arguments that were made against Irish workers, or black workers who came out of slavery and into free labor, women. These are all sort of things that we need to struggle against. So sort of the struggle against racial exclusion, gender exclusion, ethnic exclusion is a very important thing that the labor movement has done in the past, has been committed to at various points, and needs to be committed again. So when I asked them in our final class, which was yesterday actually, what did they think of the prospects, they were pretty pessimistic. They couldn't see a way to get out of the current condition we're in. But I suggested to them that there was always hope and possibility because people had ideas and commitments to change and new approaches to what the labor movement could be, that in the past that had proved to be the most successful way to organize workers. We need new strategies, we need new approaches, we need to bring new groups of workers in. And we talked a little bit about the present moment. And so rather than sort of do that, I'm going to turn this now over to Ed and everyone else to speak a little bit, to give us a little bit of a sense of what's new, what's possible about the labor movement given this context.
First of all, I would agree with that analysis, and I think that one of the things that we're suffering from right now is the lack of a class-conscious left that is pushing elements of the labor movement, although that's the union movement, I should say, because I'm going to make a distinction. I would describe this current period. There was once a great fighter named Tony Zale, who was a steel worker who worked in the coke ovens and thought boxing was a safer profession. And when he was a young fighter, he took a terrible beating one night, and at the end of the fight, thanked the referee for not stopping the fight. Because in the course of taking that beating, he learned what it would take to defeat his opponent. And I would describe that current period for us as the Tony Zale period.
So we don't have to suffer brain damage before we...
Exactly right. Well, it's too late for me. But I want to make a distinction between the union movement and the labor movement, because there are elements of the labor movement that are doing tremendously important things. And I would liken it to that period before, early 30s and 20s, when I mean, Whitman Mortimer's book, Organized, worth a look at. A couple of chapters in there describe how labor organizers spent the post-World War I period. Where were they? In the basements of churches, ethnic organizations, trying to organize then that immigration movement, trying to make links and push the then AFL to occasionally do the right thing in places. They learned all the skills they needed later on to form the CIO in that very difficult period. Although it is disheartening to realize that we have in the private sector 7.1% of the working class organized into unions. It's exactly what we had in 1901. Everything old is new again. So
it's just 100 years.
But I had to tell you, I lost my first organizing drive. I was a young worker up at Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center. We were trying to organize one unit there of about 1,100 people. We lost by about 40 votes. And one of the older organizers came to me, because I was absolutely pissed off, and said, "Come on, guy, give some credit to the boss. They work at these things." And if you look at our numbers, there's a lesson in that, and that we reached a certain peak. They never stopped organizing against us. They never accept defeat. And capital never, ever accepts the hand that they have as a pat hand. They're always looking for what's next. I mean, we know that. It is a dynamic system. How they get where they're going and the implications of that for real people is often terrible. But it is not a system that sits still and watches the world go by. They try to attack whatever they can attack to grow. Labor unions, on the other hand, we have had a tendency, at least in my lifetime, to get to what we wanted to organize and then try to close a circle around it and hold off change. And I think one of the tensions for the left inside the unions is that they begin to recognize fairly quickly, and it's why I think we lose so many young organizers, that you can't have progress without change. And yet for working class people, they hear the word new, and they often believe whatever's going to be new will be done at their expense. And they pay unions their dues, because that's their primary relationship with the union. They pay the union their dues to protect them, to keep what they have. And in some periods, very brief periods, that works and it's effective, and unions get very good at it. But when you get into a period like we've had since, I would say, the end of the Vietnam War, where the whole rules of the game are changed, capital finds a way to go global in a way that we could not imagine that they would. What was of existing Soviet socialism collapses. When I started teaching at the Marxist school here, we had just come off of 3 great movements: the women's movement, the civil rights movement, and the anti-war movement. Progressives and leftists and communists and socialists had mobilized millions, and we consolidated very little out of that in political instruments. Capital kept going, and they reorganized the world. The labor movement, when I came into it in this town, was 1.5 million more industrial manufacturing workers, 40% or more of whom were organized into unions. Workers in the private sector in those kinds of industries learn very different skills than the kinds of workforce we have now. They are in direct economic confrontation with their employers all the time, and the skills that they learn are very, very important in terms of toughness, a hardness, an understanding of how capital works. There wasn't a worker in this city in the first transit strike in the 60s that didn't understand their role, and many did not go to work. And it was the garment manufacturers and the light manufacturers in Brooklyn who called the mayor and said, "Settle the damn thing." Nobody came to work. By the time Koch is mayor and we have another strike, the mayor can arrogantly stand at the foot of the Brooklyn Bridge and yell to the people of New York City as they walked to work, "How am I doing?" To Bloomberg, who in the last transit strike could get on TV as an advocate for the poor, call working people who get out of bed every morning and go to work and play the game, call them thugs, and be hailed in the newspapers as a great mayor. It was the low point of his mayoralty, as far as I'm concerned. What allowed that to happen, though, was a very different makeup of the workforce. 72% of the union members in this town are in the public sector. And a tad more, like 12% more really in the nonprofit sector, which as far as I'm concerned is the public sector. And if you're in the public sector, that's really bad news for you. Because the standards that we have in the public sector, you get hired at DC 37, the day you're hired, you have more than 40 days off a year. That's being done on the backs of a working class that makes $10 an hour or less. They have no days off. They don't know what sick days are. We can't get a liberal like Christine Quinn to support 5 sick days for workers that the city could give 5 sick days to. They have gone through, and David Harvey points this out in his book, The Enigma of Capital, which is a very important book for this moment. After 30 years of wage suppression, those kinds of standards that they have in the public sector are unsustainable. Frankly, the social base for the undoing of those standards are in the working class. When some crank public official gets up and says we want to take away 4 days from public sector workers to help with the budget, we scream like our children were murdered. Well, for a worker that has nothing, that $10 an hour member of the working class, it doesn't make any sense. The same people that went after public schools for ideological reasons are making the teachers the focal point, putting them on the bullseye for this, precisely because they've been so successful at elevating their standards. And if they can beat them. Remember when we were organizers, we used to say sometimes you want to go after the most advanced employers and push them harder? Well, they're going after the most advanced organized sectors of the working class to take them down. And in this period where we have lost, I believe, the ideological battle, the unions are incapable of understanding the moment they live in. When the Berlin Wall came down, Nick Unger, who some of you know, called me up on the phone and said, we're fucked. And I said, yeah, we are. And the reason why he said that was because he understood that we would now spend another decade and a half thinking we were still in an alliance with U.S. capital, this post-World War sharing of the prosperities, which never really existed. And the labor movement was totally unprepared for the changes in the world economy and what would happen. And we're playing catch-up. Now, that being said, this reorganization of capital has allowed this mass migration all over the globe. The Vietnamese go to China looking for a better life. The Chinese go everywhere. Eastern Europe goes to Western Europe. The South comes north. Within the Asian continent, people are moving around. Within North America, people are moving around. This is a whole new period. In that emerges new movements. In our particular circumstance, it's interesting to me. Organized labor, as the AFL-CIO changed to win, a couple of big independents like NEA, we represent 18 million people. And the internal discussion is, what can we do? What can we do? We're tied to the hip to the Democratic Party that doesn't really want us. They just want our resources. If we can get them some votes, they'll take them. But they don't want any part of organized labor. They have been complicit in this takedown of workers' wages, and they have been complicit since Jimmy Carter. Since Jimmy Carter, Jimmy Carter makes Ronald Reagan possible when he betrays the steel workers and the auto workers. In mid-campaign for his re-election, he refuses, sends the word to the Congress, I will not sign a bill that allows workers to organize easier. And between that and the McGovern movement in the Democratic Party, the working class scatters. But in this moment, there's this other working class.
this low wage, in many cases newly arrived, but not exclusively new, working class movement that is both creating new forms of struggle, winning battles, advancing standards, and finding new ways to consolidate. I believe, and I'm going to stop here because it's more important that we move through this tonight. I believe that what the unions need to do at this point is get next to this working class movement that is organizing. Support it, embrace it, fund it. We should fund it. That's what we should do. In our decline, in our demise, if you will, the unions have enormous resources. If they can't organize the working class, then support those who do. The other piece that we need to discuss, and I don't have an answer, he raised it. We have never had our own political instrument, and we have to figure that out. We have to figure that out. We can't go through another generation without having some type. Part of the reason of the Working Families Party's reason for being was shown in the fight for the domestic workers. At least they're a political party between elections that's willing to organize on issues. And it's a tiny party with some union support, some community support. It's the left wing of the Democratic Party in many real ways here, but they show what's possible. And we need to think about that nationally. Lastly, it's very important to understand that most of the important victories that were gained this year were outside the union movement. The domestic workers bill that passes, that opens up a whole new chapter in the history of the organization of workers. The experience of the Taxi Workers Alliance in this city and their development to a point where they could lead 2 strikes in this city. And without any legal rights as workers to collective bargaining, both the city, which regulates the industry, and the employers negotiate with them all the time. And there's something to be said in that. Aronowitz always used to rant and rave about enterprise unionism. Well, we don't need contracts, but we have to figure out ways to consolidate these things. A lot of the worker center type movements take very different approaches to these struggles. There's a lot for us to learn there. They accomplish on many things. The hard part is going to be, without a class conscious left, and without even a mildly watered down, pardon me if you will, social democratic party, it's going to be very hard to consolidate these gains in the long run. And that's going to be figured out. But I believe that this movement, which is taking new steps to create new national forms, they're going to get there. And anyway, I'm running, my throat is like chopped meat tonight, so I'm going to pass the baton.
Wow, I feel like I just learned so much. Thank you, Steve and Ed, for that. So I'm Ai-jen with the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and the movement that I'm part of is about 15 years old. In 1998, when I first started organizing with domestic workers, there were probably 3 or 4 organizations in immigrant communities around the country who were bringing domestic workers together to organize. And today, there are at least 33 organizations in 17 cities around the country. So we're a movement that's grown a lot over the last 15 years. And we're part of a broader movement of worker centers and independent workers organizations that have come up largely out of immigrant community organizing to meet the day-to-day needs of workers who are struggling every day. And our movement of domestic workers has gone through a very important growth period in the last 5 years or so, between launching a statewide campaign here in New York to win a Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, and the establishment of our national alliance 3 years ago at the U.S. Social Forum in Atlanta. It's allowed for a movement to grow and consolidate and connect and coordinate and work together strategically in ways that help to catalyze our impact and raise our profile. And this year, with New York's domestic workers organizations winning the Bill of Rights passage, which was the first law in the country. The first law in the country to provide recognition and protections for domestic workers. We believe it affects about 200,000, mostly immigrant women of color, who do this work every day, making it possible for everybody else to go to work. Now that we have this national alliance, our sister organizations in California have launched a California Domestic Workers Bill of Rights campaign, and they're introducing legislation in January. And a month ago, our affiliates in Massachusetts got together and decided that they're going to launch a Massachusetts statewide Bill of Rights campaign. So there's really exciting momentum happening around the country. And we're in this moment where there's a window to make pretty historic advances in the protections for domestic workers. For the very first time, the International Labor Organization is going to be enacting international law on domestic work. This June in Geneva will be the final round of negotiations, and for the past 2 years, every country, every major labor federation that's part of the United Nations has been discussing issues of domestic work. And that's largely because our movement is not just a movement in the United States, but it's a global movement of domestic workers around the world who've been organizing and trying to demand a better life and a better future all over the world. So there's this moment, and one of the things that's been really interesting is, as we looked around to our sister and brother organizations, that the worker center movement has really, really grown. And a lot of the industries where worker centers were organizing have reached a new level of impact and organization, and many of them have national networks that are sector-based and have industry-wide strategies for how they're building power and shifting power in their sectors. So the National Day Labor Organizing Network has over 40 worker centers that are affiliated with it around the country. The taxi workers have an international network, and the Restaurant Opportunity Center represents 7 cities around the country. So there's this very powerful new level of organization and infrastructure that exists for this organizing. And now, all of us are working together in what's called the Excluded Workers Congress, where for the first time this summer at the U.S. Social Forum in Detroit, we got together 9 sectors of workers who are excluded from the labor law in different ways. Taxi drivers, domestic workers, formerly incarcerated workers, workers in right to work for less states in the South, farm workers, guest workers, who am I missing? Restaurant workers, I always forget one. But there's a website now called excludedworkers.org, and you can read about all the sectors. And we're working together to have a voice and to help transform the labor movement, which we very much feel a part of. And we're very invested in a powerful and vibrant labor movement. And in fact, one of the things that having the Excluded Workers Congress has enabled us to do is actually start a series of strategic dialogues with our allies in the AFL-CIO and in Change to Win unions about what we do in this period. How do we create a new path to power for the working class in this period? How do we organize? How do we build and transform the labor movement in such a way that it can really represent the hopes and dreams of today's working class for the 21st century. So that's a lot of what we're doing together, in addition to the work that we're doing to organize domestic workers around the country. And we feel very optimistic about the potential. There's a lot of openness on the part of the leadership inside trade union movements to work in partnership with worker centers and to learn from the work that's been done. And so I think that there's a lot of hope there. So on that note.
Great. Hi, everybody. I'm Beta Vitasai. I'm with the New York Taxi Workers Alliance. There's so much that was said that it's like given me so much to think about. Well, we're kind of in an interesting position in light of, I think, the discussion that's we've already been having, because we are an independent. We see ourselves as a union. We don't actually call ourselves a workers' center. But there was a union in our industry. I mean, taxi drivers had collective bargaining rights years ago when our industry was structured under the commission system, and so whatever was on the meter was split between the driver and the bosses. Usually, depending on your seniority, the rate depended on your seniority in that particular garage. But as commission workers, drivers were classified as employees under the national labor laws. And so there was an SCIU local that represented them at the time. By the early 70s, I mean, it became really a boss's union. There was a very active rank and file movement, and I know that to this day, a lot of the activists from the taxi rank and file, they had their own newspaper. It was basically like dissidents within the union, left dissidents, and they still meet frequently. And when I first started organizing, they were a lot of the folks who I used to go to the garages with. So there was a push from the city to transition from commission to present-day leasing, and the union, of course, had to take it to the rank and file. So the members voted against it because they knew. I mean, who's going to go from being an employee where you could have, where you had union rights, you had health care. You did, you split whatever was on the meter. You didn't bear the risks of the job onto becoming lease drivers, where you started in negative every day. You're no longer employees. You're independent contractors. There's no, payroll contribution, right? No Social Security contribution from the bosses. There's no procedure left for grievances. There's no more firings, right? Because it's dealings really between a business and an independent contractor, and so labor laws don't govern that relationship. It's a business-to-business relationship. So, of course, the rank and file voted it down. So the union overnight called a meeting with the pensioners and told the pensioners that you're going to get a better pension under leasing, and that's how they were able to ratify that vote. I still remember when I started, one of the first, within the first several years, there was a big ceremony at the Taxi and Limousine Commission where it was Ben Goldberg, who was the president of the old taxi union, Local 3036 for years, he was retiring or something, I don't know, but they had some award ceremony for him. And the person who actually gave him the award was the president of the Bosses Association at the time, and that particular president actually lost his position within the owners' organization. The owners have the drivers' union, right? The union lost the contract in about 1997, but the owners' association predates the union, and it's continued to go on since 3036 folded. So that particular president lost his presidency to the current president, Ron Sherman. He's like one of the wealthiest guys in the city, because the first thing that Sherman did, there used to be a lease permit machine. So under leasing, the union held a private contract with the garages. And because there were no paychecks in our industry, there's no salaries, no wages. And so the way that the union collected its dues is there would be a machine at every garage. And so drivers would have to pay the $3 every single day, and then you get the little ticket, then you would bring it over to the dispatcher, and only then you would get the cab. And out of the $3, like one went to the union, one went to the health and benefits fund, and the third dollar went back to the company. So so Sherman was the first garage owner to remove that machine off his premises. And so overnight, he became president of that association. He's still the president of it today. And like, we know that the reason that the MTBOT, the owners group, ended their sweetheart contract is because we were organizing. And they were very, the rumbling in the industry was that if we don't get rid of this contract, this new leadership is going to take over somehow. And so and there was a clause in that contract that once the lease permit machines were removed from the garage, it would in effect end the contract. I mean, tells you everything you need to know about the content of that contract, right? So this was in the mid-1990s, and so up until I'd say from 96 to something like 2000, when we first started organizing, if you said the word union, drivers were just gonna kill you. I mean, I remember going out to garages where people had so much more passion and deep-seated rage talking about the union than they did compared to when they talked about the bosses. And you're talking about a group of, highly exploited workers, right? I mean, where there's no guaranteed income, you're 60 times more likely to be killed on the job than any other worker. There's no health and benefits. There's no 8-hour day. Shifts are 12 hours long. There's no standard contract. I mean, we're independent contractors. There's no contract and very little independence. And even, hyper ticketing by the city, rules that majority of the rule book in the Taxi Limousine Commission, even though it's always talk about public safety, and reckless driving, the majority of that rule book, 90% of those rules, pertain to when the taxi is stationary, because the TLC is basically, it's a function of labor control in the industry. And so, given all of that, it's still the union that the drivers would react against. And I mean, we can all understand why. You don't expect your boss to treat you well, but your union's supposed to protect you. And so, so when we first started, a lot of the conversation was about, well, okay, but let's separate the idea of the union from the current leadership, or let's talk about a new formation for a union. That, there are people in the labor movement who believe in union democracy, right? And, how can that play out in our industry? But gradually that discussion really started to change. But of course, the main thing that it wasn't language or vocabulary that changed the dialogue. What changed the dialogue was the fact that we were an organization that was willing to fight on the issues that mattered to the drivers. And we were willing to take positions that may have been unpopular even to the public. Of course, they'd be unpopular to the industry and to the administration, but even if they were unpopular with the public, we didn't care. What we cared about was what was right for the drivers, and what would eventually, not only, protect people's right to, respect and dignity on the job, and really begin to transform that inequity between the drivers and the TLC, the NYPD, to the garages and the brokers, the dispatchers that work for them. The airport dispatchers, they actually used to be under the same union as the taxi drivers. You would not believe it, because it's more like a supervisory relationship where, you go now to Kennedy Airport. If the dispatcher doesn't like a driver for X, Y, and Z reason, all they have to do is write up a summons. The driver has to go to court, because the city has basically deputized them, to be enforcement agents against the drivers. So, doing that work, allowed us to show not that we were a union in word, but that we were a union in spirit. The other thing that we really had to take on was the fact that there's over, it's a workforce today of over about 50,000 licensed yellow cab drivers today in the city. Up until from the mid-90s, it was really about 40,000. So you've always had a massive surplus pool of labor in this industry, because today we have 13,237 taxi cabs, and roughly 2 shifts per cab, so it's 26,000 jobs, but you've got 50,000 license holders, and so that means that so we always say we don't have jobs in the industry, and we have rentals. The garage is not going to look at who's got the best driving record, who's got seniority, who's made all their payments to them in time, has built up a relationship to them. What they look at is who's going to be the highest bidder, one, and two, who's going to be the youngest driver, the newest driver, because the veterans know what their rights are, right? They're going to argue back with that dispatcher. They're not going to give the bribe under the table. So they're looking for people. They want that revolving door because it suits their purposes. And even though you would think from a purely public policy perspective, that does not suit the interests of the city, right? But yet it's the city that's maintained that, deal for them. Because what the city cares about is the value of the medallion. Because the city auctions off the medallions, they're really the ones that own it, and the owners have to buy it from them. So the medallion back in 1971 was valued at about $30,000. Today, that same piece of tin is now valued, the latest number is $875,000. You could see that number go up as leasing came into play, as obviously as drivers' incomes came down, as more and more of the risks of the industry were socialized onto the backs of the drivers. And the more those risks were socialized, the more the profits were privatized. And so not only do the bosses not have to pay personnel expenses, not just healthcare and taxes, but basic wages, incomes, they're also, all the costs of operation go into the actual lease, so drivers are paying for that. Now, the bosses get paid up front, and so, if the car breaks down, if there's inclement weather, last night, on a Tuesday night anyway, the shift is dead starting at 1 in the morning. When you have the weather like we did last night, past really 11:30, 12, you're just not going to see business. But the shift it's up to 5 a.m. And so you're working desperate. You're lucky if you make 1 fare per hour after, during hours like that. And the only reason you even make 1 fare per hour is because you're counting on your fellow drivers to actually go home. So you reduce your competition. So, but those garages got their lease money up front. There's no risk that they have to take. After 9/11, we were directly impacted. 90% of trips from Manhattan to the airport originate in Lower Manhattan, 14th Street and below. And the number one mode of transportation from Manhattan to the airport is yellow taxi cab. And so even though drivers couldn't locate passengers, the bosses actually had the nerve to put in a proposal that was going to double the leases that they were collecting from drivers. And our good old friend Rudolph Giuliani actually took on that proposal, initiated it for rulemaking, had a public hearing, had the votes until we were able to go in and we jammed up that hearing. And we actually got his own commissioners to turn on the vote, and that's how he lost. Simply because he was lame duck at that point. That was really the only political thing we had going for us. Because the garages, I kid you not, had like several state senators, assembly members, Medallion Funding, which is the main financial corporation in the industry. They finance the majority of medallions, and therefore, we're candid. Andrew Murstein, he's now interested in buying some racetrack. I mean, the guy's like a billionaire off the, blood and sweat of drivers. They on their board of commissioners is our former Governor Cuomo. So they had all these like political heavyweights out there, but we had the numbers. And by numbers, I don't just mean the numbers in terms of working poverty, but I mean numbers in terms of people. That we were able to pack that room, and that's what essentially turned that vote. And so for us, we've had no choice but to be militant. The laws don't work for us. The local government, its mandate is to make sure nobody works for us. The bosses have such consolidated wealth, you cannot break into this industry. It's not new blood that comes in. It's all old money. It's all family-owned businesses. It's like $1 trillion industry at this point, because when you think not only of the medallion, but you have to think of like the auto manufacturers. Ford's had a monopoly. You have to think of the meter shops. Now you have to think of the stupid TV screens in the back. The repair shops. I mean, there's so many industries that have their hands. The airports alone, drivers complete 15,000 trips from Kennedy, another 15,000 from LaGuardia every 24 hours. So think of all those airlines that are dependent. So there is so much, and every time we think we've taken down one corporate entity, like a new one pops up. In this industry, they're continually trying to create a new market. So now the latest, first it was around the TV screens and that technology. Now the newest market is a purpose-built vehicle to give a monopoly of one company. You can outfit 13,237 cabs with your product. You're gonna get that contract in every other city in the entire North America. It's certainly major parts of Europe, and now increasingly parts of Australia and Asia. So when you think of all that opposition, and you think of the fact that there's ethnic divisions among the workers, and for us it wasn't among black and white workers. It was among South Asian workers, where you've got Pakistanis and Bangladeshis who just recently had there was a liberation war, right? And then you've got Pakistanis and Indians, and we've had 3 wars and counting, that we know of officially, and so it was all these kinds of differences. So really, I think to confront such dire circumstances, right? I mean, you've got nothing, and you have nothing to lose, right? I mean, you're gonna fight for the world to win, because that's all you've got left. So, and I think in many ways, I mean, militancy, it was not some sort of an ideological, it wasn't some sort of an ideological, conscious decision on our part. It was literally our only way to stay breathing in this industry and within these circumstances. So, I think I'll end there and have discussion.
We can, let's give the audience a chance to.
Yeah, I just want to ask one question just because you just brought it up. I'm saying that when you're up against something that is obviously so like such a system of opposition politically and capitalistically speaking, how do you explain something so inexplicable like Patterson shooting down the legislation to protect you against
Right.
assault, which is when the same legislation has been passed for everywhere in the public sector over the past few years, and obviously I guess it's going to be retabled soon, but
Yeah.
that was just I'm curious how members of the TWA would react to that,
Oh, it
and
is.
how it's such a no-brainer. I'm saying as
It would have made assaults on it wouldn't make assaults on drivers a felony. That's what the transit workers have, which is what our new bill would do. But it would have increased the penalties. And so for misdemeanor assault, which currently have a maximum of 1 year jail time, the bill would have made it 2 years of jail time if the victim was a taxi driver assaulted in the course of duty. Also, we would have gotten a warning in the back seat that says, warning, an assault of a taxi driver is punishable up to 25 years in prison. Which, for us, that was actually the main thing that we were angling for, especially when the first thing you see is a passenger's Bill of Rights and the right to English-speaking cab. We couldn't think of a better way to kind of even that score. And we got the Senate passed it unanimously. In the Assembly, we only had one objecting vote. We still don't know who that jerk is, but trying to figure that out. But and we were sure Patterson would sign off on it. At the very, very end, literally at the last hour, he vetoed the bill, and he said it's because for no other class would our misdemeanors. Was there like a punishment of over 1 year of jail time if no other class that's assaulted. And our thing was, well, when you pass the bill for transit workers, there's a precedent. Like, why can't you create a precedent with us? I tell you, I think there are two things that happen. One is obviously, he's a lame duck, and I think there's a lot of things he's done which have been really kind of, which have been really surprising and kind of, up to devastating. I kind of think the second thing is, right before the vote took place, we had a very high-profile incident of one of our members, Ahmed Sharif, who was a victim of a hate crime. He was the driver who was slashed across the neck and on the face and on the hand by a passenger who first grilled him. That once he learned that Ahmed was Muslim, and he asked, "Are you Muslim? Where are you from? How long have you been driving?" And then and then he attacked him. Well, when that issue came, when the incident happened, we immediately said this is in light of the environment that's been created by the Lower Manhattan Cultural Center, so-called debate. And we all know where Patterson stood in that debate. Now, Patterson actually initially put out a statement saying, if everybody had just listened to me, this poor cabbie would have been saved. We were disgusted by the statement, and so we went after him. Publicly. He was forced to take the statement down, and he retracted his words. But I think the veto was actually payback, to be honest with you. Because if you look at the memorandum, the memo he did with that veto, it was so personal. He actually went after, and everyone we talked to said they'd never seen this in any veto message before, where he literally went after Assemblyman Rory Lansman, who was the main, the legislator that championed the bill, who authored it. Actually took a cheap shot against Lansman, saying that Lansman should have known better than to kind of tinker with the judicial, the justice system, criminal justice system of New York State, because he was too busy listening to special interests. I mean, obviously was us.
Right, I'm saying
Um,
that you're up against people
Also
who are
using
like,
all the pandering.
Right, so he was pandering to us, and you know, yeah, it was like it was just insult, you know, on injury.